Okay. It is the appointed minute. Yes, I can be heard. So we should start because we have a very full agenda. I was fortunate. We have Mallory doing JabberScribe, and we have Corinne doing note-taking. The notepad is there for other people to add, and of course, others can add to the Jabber, but thank you very much. So moving forward, this is the IETF Research Group on Human Rights Protocol Considerations, HRPC. And yeah, the administrative, we have a mailing list, there's GitHub, there's Meet Echo, there's minutes, there's a website. The agenda and the agenda bash. We start with the beginning, the scribe and note takers agenda review, assorted document status, update from the hackathon, Luca discussing network self-determination, update on guidelines, update on anonymity, update on association, update on political, update on implementation of 451, a discussion of the human rights review team, discussion of any drafts that are either under 8280 consideration review or should be. If there's time, open discussion, and if there's time, any other business. Notice that the times are short, so hopefully we can keep to subjects of content and not just go through things that are in the document that others can read, but try to both have people do the reports and be able to talk. So any comments on the agenda, any changes, any bashing, anything wrong with it? Hearing nothing, we'll go on with it. So now then we'll go to the assorted, there's the note well. Read the note well. I was actually in a meeting today where somebody read it out loud. I will not. Is this the new one or the old one?
New one.
It's the new one. Sorry. It's the new one. So you really ought to read it if you haven't read it since you read the old one. Okay, document review. Document quality relies on reviews. We need lots of people to review them. And we've been getting some, but not a lot. So read not only the ones you're working on, but other ones this is brought. And if you like documents you care about reviewed, put the effort in to review other documents. You must be reviewing a lot of documents, considering how many documents you're getting us to review.
And because I care so much.
And you do. That's good. Okay, so please, but also we need people to review our documents more. The status of the group. Basically where we are now is March 2018. I will not read through all that. What has changed is we had no research group documents accepted as of IETF 100. We had finished 8280, did a call on the group list to see which ones should be made research group documents. Two of them there was general consensus that they should be. There's a couple others where there's still open discussion, and I think they're on their way there, but the group itself didn't quite have comfortable. We can check after they're discussed here to see whether people feel they're ready to become research group documents. But if not, we'll keep working to that. There's no great win in having it be a research group document than your private document, but perhaps it looks better. Yeah, he likes it better. And I understand it, but the thing that I bring up is it's your document before it becomes a research group document. And once it becomes a research group document, it kind of comes community property, and community property can always be an interesting challenge. Okay, context and objective of the research group: to expose the relation between protocols and human rights with a focus on the rights to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and association. Now, we are not limited to just looking at those It's just that those are the initial focal point, but since rights cannot be divided from each other, it's understood that we will discuss other rights as we go along. To propose guidelines to protect the internet as a human rights enabling environment in future protocol development in a manner similar to the work done for privacy considerations in RFC 6973. And just an aside on that one, if you now notice the pervasiveness to which people are actually talking about privacy, the number of working groups where there's at least one draft, there's at least one discussion of going into privacy elements. I see more and more at each of the IETFs. If we can reach that status with the work we're doing so that work, our work becomes as solid as that work is, we'll have done really quite well. To increase the awareness in both the human rights community and the technical community on the importance of the technical workings of the internet and its impact on human beings. Oh no, first we had the hackathon, correct? In the agenda? We can go first with this, but I thought we had the hackathon first. But since this is the slide that came up, Luca, would you like to go? And then we'll do the hackathon after. We had them in the opposite order on the agenda, but if nobody objects, then of course you can.
And I guess I have to.
You have to stand in the box. Thank you. And tell a little, present yourself as it were when you start. A newcomer to our crowd.
Thank you, Nils. So good morning to everyone. Thank you, Nils Avery, for the kind invitation. I'm Luca Belli. I'm senior researcher at the Center for Technology and Society of FGV. FGV is Fundação Getúlio Vargas, is one of the main academic institutions in Brazil, is currently ranked as the 7th most influential think tank worldwide, and it has been ranked as the most influential think tank in Latin America over the past 8 years. The work I would like to speak about with you today is this work on network self-determination is part of my work at FGV. I had the Internet Governance Project, which deals primarily with connectivity and data governance, and this work actually has a little bit of both. First of all the information I'm going to share with you today are taken from an article I published in this book. The name of the article is Network Self-Determinations and the Positive Externalities of Community Networks. And this book that has been officially released at the IGF in December is the official outcome of the Dynamic Coalition on Community Connectivity. Is a group, a multi-stakeholder open group of the IGF that analyzes community networks and the community network model. And you can freely share it and download it and do whatever you want with the book. So network self-determination. What am I speaking about? It's a right to develop your own network infrastructure. And it is what I think could be seen as an instrumental condition for people to enjoy and fully exercise their fundamental rights. This is the definition, quite long, that I provide, is the right to freely associate, and to define in a democratic fashion the design, the development, the management of the network infrastructure as a common good. And this is to freely seek, impart, and receive information and innovation. Those who are familiar with human rights law, I think have already spotted some elements that we will analyze in the second part of the presentation. And first, why this is relevant here? Well, I think it resonates with the work the HRPC has been doing, particularly with RFC 8280, and the fact that you explicitly say that the design and development of the network infrastructure has a growing impact on society, and the internet should, can be considered as an enabling environment for human rights. So the fact that by building the internet you enjoy your human rights is actually that should quite resonate with your work. So coming back to network self-determination, finally, it's a concept that is both based on human rights law and on empirical evidences. So let's start with the facts, with the observable phenomena that allow me to state quite confidently that network self-determination actually already exists de facto. So as of Monday, the world population was about 7.6 billion individuals, and the internet population was 3.87. So more or less 50%. According to this more optimistic visualization, is the global average is 53%, and then you have the average of the various region, which is well, it's nice to see as a visualization, but it's not really useful because the problem with this kind of visualization is that you always find only the average. This kind of visualization, on the other hand, is much more intriguing and interesting because it allows us to understand where are those 3.6 billion individuals connected to the internet. And it is immediate to see that you have people in the most developed country with the highest standard of living, and particularly in urban areas that are connected. And then you have, it is not desert, all the rest. There are people living there, but it's especially in rural areas, connectivity is the level of connectivity are much lower. And I think it's not working anymore. Okay, this is particularly evident if we narrow down to Brazil. This is Brazil. You see that in the coast, where the major cities are, you can spot all the red and yellow, which are the connected people, and all the rest, the rural areas are much less connected. But this is not only a problem of developing countries or non-developed countries. Of course, it is much more relevant in developing or non-developed country, but in highly developed countries such as the EU members, the problem is not that different. Well, of course, is less intense, but you still have rural areas that have half of the average of the total European Union. And if you see this graph with all the member states, in rural areas, there are countries, well, more than half have less than 50% of rural areas that are connected. And some countries like Italy with 65 million inhabitants, rural areas only have 15% of the territory that is connected. So it's actually quite telling of how the lack of connectivity may also impact developed country. And so the conclusion that I start to draw from this is that mainstream networks are not so mainstream. And when I speak about mainstream networks, I refer to what the request for comment 7962 calls mainstream network. So the alternative network deployment RFC provides a taxonomy of and identify mainstream networks as usually, I mean, the traditional networks, large network that span large areas, controlled by traditional operators in a top-down fashion. They require substantial investment to be deployed, and there is no user participation in the governance, deployment, the operation of the network. And so here we can start to think, why are people not connected to this mainstream network? There are several explanations, several factors, and they depend in different countries. In different countries, you can have a completely different importance of these factors, but they are primarily these four. First of all, connectivity is not available. This is simple economics. If there is a rural area with few inhabitants or a periphery with very low standard of living, an operator will not have a return in investment to expand network there. Or when some operator venture into this area, then they may be the only player. So the lack of competition may keep the prices very high. And there are some studies, for instance, by Carlos Rey Moreno in South Africa, that explain that people have to sacrifice food to buy connectivity. And then there is lack of interest, which, if you think about it, we see the interest of the internet. But if you're in a rural community, you may need local government services, local e-commerce platform to trade local goods and local services, news in local languages. If you don't have them, you don't really see an interest in connecting to the internet. And again, the low level of literacy and numeracy is, especially in the developing countries, one of the main causes, because if you don't really understand how the internet works and you really not have basic skills, it's quite hard to understand what are the benefits that you may have by connecting to the internet. So what my consideration is, what if you could build the internet yourself? What if people could mitigate at least some of these elements that I was mentioning by building their own internet? Well, the people are already doing so since almost 20 years by building community networks. These are crowdsourced networks. They are built by a group of individuals and managed by them in a bottom-up fashion as a common good. So they are managed by the local community as commons. And this gives rise to a distributed architecture. Actually, it brings us back to the original philosophy of the internet, a network of networks where people can add new networks, and those networks will interoperate through open standards that are developed here at the IETF. And actually, this is quintessentially decentralized. And this architecture is usually put in place using wireless technology, low-cost Wi-Fi equipment, and the use of unlicensed spectrum to run those equipment, or maybe TV white space it with dynamic spectrum allocation. But it can also build on fiber. And there are some pretty impressive results. Here are some of the most outstanding and renowned examples of community networks. And the one that you see there on the corner on the right, Barn, broadband for the rural north, which is the British champion, built in Lancashire by local farmers and a hairdresser that were kind of tired of being disconnected and decided to create their own network, which now connects hundreds of people and provides a speed of up to 1 gigabyte per second, which is, as they proudly say, more than what NASA has. So besides this benefit of having access to information, having connectivity, obviously, that we all know, there are also collateral effects, external effect. It's a virtuous circle of knowledge and innovation that is triggered by this. Because when the community is involved, there are new services that are developed by the locals, for the locals. So the famous government services or local language content that I was speaking about before, they are developed by the locals that are into the community networks for the locals. So in almost all community networks, you see this phenomenon, the development of maps, voice over IP, local fora, e-health applications. In the Nepal network wireless project, they have developed an application for pregnant women to receive information about pregnancy that also stimulates use of smartphone by people living in Himalaya zones. So it's quite impressive result. So all the positive externalities of the do-it-yourself connectivity, of course, freedom of expression, freedom to impart, receive, seek information, ideas, but also the education that comes with it, and capacity building, because people that are actually developing networks usually also provide training for the locals. And they provide training for the locals, so the locals actually start develop new services, as I was mentioning before. This is permissionless innovation, meaning that people develop the services, the apps that they need, and they freely share it and they freely access them. And that is precisely what creates a more interesting internet. Because if you don't see the interest of the internet, when you have exactly the service that your neighbor needs, the internet becomes much more interesting. And it fosters decentralization, because as I was saying before, those are new networks that are added at the edges. So quintessentially decentralized architecture. And also, last but not least, obviously, employment opportunities. Gifinet, which is one of the most renowned community network, and it's the biggest currently in the world, employs more than 100 people only for maintenance. Those are direct jobs created by the network. And I'm not counting all the developers and app providers that may be created, they may be promoted by the local connectivity used as a commons. So I think so far I've provided a little bit of empirical basis on which we can start to think that network self-determination already exists de facto. Now let's see very quickly how it can be constructed de jure using international human rights law. If we come back to the definition I provided at the very beginning, we can decompose it in three elements. The right to freely associate, the definition of the network governance as a commons, and the freedom to seek, import, and receive information and innovation. The first and the third are quite self-explanatory, meaning that the first is simply the right to freely associate. It's already protected by very explicitly by human rights binding instrument. The third is a simple rephrasing of freedom of expression. Traditionally, it is defined as the right to freely seek, impart, and receive information and ideas. Here, I'm just substituting ideas with innovation because an idea in the digital ecosystem can easily translate into a new application, a new technology, and people should be, actually are, according to fundamental human rights law, free to share, receive, and access those ideas. And the second part is a little bit more tricky. Why? Because there is no agreed definition of what is democracy in human rights law. So the right to define in a democratic fashion the network governance, well, one has to understand what does democratic means. And here we usually, international human rights law, you will refer to the right to self-determination and the internal dimension of self-determination. There are two dimensions. One is external dimension of self-determination, the right to have a territorially independent state, sovereign states. It is not this what interests us. And I don't want to start a discussion about territorial independence in the UK, which is not the most advisable thing to do. Recently, I want to focus on something else, which is what really interests us: internal self-determination. So the right to define a governance system according to the will of the people. It's really the etymology, demos kratos, the government of the people. And this right to self-determination is so important, which is that is the first right, not only of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but of both international covenants of fundamental rights. The same wording, the same phrasing in Article 1 of the 3 document. All people must be free to determine their political status, this is external dimension, and to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And if you are fundamentally free to pursue your economic, social, and cultural development, you are free to develop your own network, to develop your service, and to share them, and to have them accessed by whomever you want to do. And then here we finish with the last cherry on top of self-determination, which is informational self-determination, a concept developed in the early 80s by the German Supreme Court, which defines it as the capability of an individual to determine who can access and use his or personal data. Basically, is the founding basis of the right to data protection, which is enshrined explicitly in Article 8 of the European Charter of Human Rights and is at the basis of all the 125 national data protection frameworks around the world, which is the right to know who is collecting data about you and how those data are being used and for what purpose. So why this is important? This becomes very important if you consider your personal data are money. Your personal data are the digital currency that is used to pay services. And it's not only money, it's really the most important resource you have in the world. And if you think in internet terms, the main business model you have so far is zero price model, right? You don't pay with money, you pay with data. Well, the same logic, the zero price logic has been transposed over the past 4 or 5 years to zero rating offerings, which are another strategy that has been advocated by several operators to provide subsidized services, applications to unconnected individuals. So this is basically price discrimination. You do not count the data consumption of specific services against the monthly data allowance of the user, but what are the purposes? Why are these strategies being implemented? It's not only because telecom operators have magically become philanthropists. It's because there is a commercial logic behind. First of all, you attract new users if you give them a gift. I will give you a free service. But if you think about it, that gift is only useful if you have no access or a very reduced data cap every month. If you have the possibility to create your own network and your own services, you don't need a free one application as a gift, because you're already having all the applications that to which you can connect through your network, plus the one that you really need, you're developing them through your community network. The orientation of user choice and user attention towards specific applications is also another reason of these strategies. And user attention in the eyeball economy equals to data. Data are the most valuable resource. So I will give you the example of Brazil, where despite being this practice illegal, operators are providing integrated services so that they can bypass the prohibition to harvest data on their users through applications that are providing that harvest data of the users. And then, last but not least, selling the preferential access to your own customers to the application providers that are willing and financially able to pay for this preferential access. So this obviously, this kind of strategy presents some advantage for the app consumer, because you have a free app. But the problem is that it is an advantage for that app consumer, not from the internet user. And it transforms actually all the potential internet users and prosumers into app consumers, because that is what is free. And that is particularly evident in developing countries where people do not have the money to buy access and have free access subsidized to specific services, and they turn out to be only users of those applications. Again, Brazil is very telling. Only 3 weeks ago, the Brazilian Institute for Geography and Statistics, which is a public entity releasing statistics on Brazilians every 3 months, started for the first time to release data on what are the main reasons for which Brazilians access the internet. And 94% of Brazilians access the internet to use messaging applications. Now, it might be that Brazilians really love messaging applications, or it might also be that WhatsApp is the only application that is subsidized by all operators. And this, if you are any behavioral designer will explain you that a good application is the one that hooks the user into the application. And therefore, maybe by subsidizing only a couple of applications, you are hooking people into those applications. So maybe, yes, the previous consumer of those applications will have a benefit. But those that may have focused their attention in building connectivity, new networks, and new services have their attention and data drained into what is subsidized. And all what is subsidized, obviously, is chosen by the operators and the sponsors. And this, I think, risks to transform the internet into a centralized rather than decentralized environment, and fragment it into clusters of users of integrated services of the operators or dominant services. If you want to know more about what services are zero-rated in the world, with the IGF Dynamic Coalition on Net Neutrality, we have built this nice tool that allows you to see in 87 countries so far what are the services that are zero-rated and what are the zero-rating policies and net neutrality policy. And no surprise, the Facebook group applications, meaning WhatsApp, primarily Facebook, and sometimes Instagrams, are those that are zero-rated in all countries, basically, and with some rare exceptions. And, well, this leads us to what I rather provocatorily define minitalization of the internet, which is the transformation of the internet from an open, general purpose network into a centralized and predefined purpose network. But that is not the only option. It is probably the most advertised option, but as I was explaining in the first part, people can develop their own network. So why shouldn't they be allowed to do so? Thank you very much for your attention, and all information are here. And I hope I've been enough provocatory to trigger questions.
Thank you. Yes, we have about 5 minutes that we can go to questions. So if we do have any, or were there any in Jabber? But none in...
I expect a defense of Minitel from at least one person.
So please come to the line. Thank you.
There is no French in the room. Otherwise, we would. Please.
Nick Doty, UC Berkeley. Thanks for your talk. It was very interesting. I was curious about the early set of slides about access in rural areas. So I guess I had sort of one clarification and one sort of open question. I'm curious, when we're describing these percentages, whether the percentages, can you show that chart? Yeah. Whether these percentages, is that the percentage of people in rural areas who have access, or is it the percentage of areas that...
It's the broadband coverage in rural areas, according to European Commission's report. It's freely available in the BCO website, the Broadband Capacity Office website.
And is that coverage by people or coverage by like area?
By area, I mean by network deployment in rural areas. Am I responding to your question or not?
Is that like the number of people who live in rural, the fraction of people who live in rural areas who have access, or the fraction of
the territory?
Of territory.
Yes.
Because we might want to know what fraction of people who live in a rural area, because it might be that actually 99% of people who live in rural areas have access, but lots of rural areas which have no people don't have access.
Well, the conclusion of the study is that 39% of the rural areas is not covered. So maybe in that 39%, all people are living there. It is a possibility. But I think it is unlikely as a scenario, although it is possible.
Yeah. Okay. And then the sort of more general question was, you were pointing out that we should be thinking about self-determination, and that the creation of our the sort of DIY creation of networks might speak specifically to self-determination. I'm curious if we have any idea about how many people are not connected to the internet because they don't want to be, versus how many are not connected because they don't have the capability or financial success.
So I have a double reply. The first one is that, I mean, when you have even your freedom of expression, you have a fundamental right. Freedom of communication is a fundamental right, but it's not an obligation. You don't have to be connected. And if your choice is not to be connected, it's a perfectly respectable choice.
Yeah.
But if you are not connected, because no one is investing in your area, or because the price is too high, or simply because you would want to do it, but you don't have accessible information, well, this may solve some of the problems. Obviously, it is not a silver bullet. It's not going to community networks are not going to bring high quality connectivity everywhere in the world, but it is part of the solution, I think. And they do not limit the right of anyone, by being constructed. So if your right to network self-determination does not limit anyone else's right. So why shouldn't you enjoy it?
Sorry, you're saying the fact that I would join into the network doesn't prevent someone else, or?
I mean, the fact that the local community develop networks is not hindering someone else's right. It's only bringing more rights to some community that are disconnected.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. I want to cut the line after Mallory, but please go ahead.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Andrew Sullivan. So I really like this. Thank you very much. One thing you were talking a little bit about subsidization of and zero rating and so on, and the way that promotes certain kinds of applications. But I wonder to what extent you think the logic of applications makes for winner take all anyway, because at an application layer in a web environment, there's basically no advantage to standardization, right? Everybody can just use the application as it is, and so what this means is, because of the way network effects work, it's better to be on the application that everybody else is using than not. Now, this also promotes the minitelization that you were talking about. That is, it turns the internet into like a sort of boring substrate for these monopoly applications. But it also means that there's literally there's no subsidy, so there isn't really a lot of there's not a lot of public policy tool that you could use to try to discourage that, just because the advantage accrues to the users. Well, the thing is that you are seeing this from the perspective of someone that is already a user of the application, a consumer of the application, and that has a benefit. I'm not saying, I'm not rebuttaling that point. I'm taking the other point of view, which is the point of view actually of the 3.6 billion that are not connected and maybe don't even know what are those monopolistic apps. So if you don't even know what they are, if someone is given you for free, as you were saying, that it creates some sort of, I mean, I don't know if we're not saying it explicitly, but it creates a sort of path dependency. So you start using that. It's like, I mean, I know that I've been enough provocative today to have another provocation. So it's like, I don't know if you remember in the 90s, those scandals about tobacco company giving to kids in Africa free cigarettes, right? It creates a sort of dependency. Okay. And if you, again, I was mentioning behavioral design, because a good application is the one that creates addiction. Right. If you don't create an addiction, you have failed with an application. Right. So if you're giving that for free to people that don't even have basic literacy skills, well, you have a very good chance of creating a good addiction. So if you are an individual, a non-connected, maybe literate individual, you're excused because you don't know this. But if you are a government that also see all the world's most valuable resource of his citizens being drained away, you will not be excused for this.
Okay, got it. Thanks. Niels ten Hoover for the record. Thanks so much. Really interesting, and I'd like to pick up exactly where you just left with the final answer. You go, what? And would you comment on why you think that the right to network self-determination is more useful than a governmental obligation to network provision? So why do you put the obligation for the gathering of the social, financial, and cultural capital with the individual, whereas they would already be disenfranchised?
I mean, I'm not putting any obligation. I'm putting the right to do it. Doesn't mean that, again, it's the same thing of communication. You have a right, not an obligation. Meaning that what I'm just pointing out is that if you and your community members want to develop infrastructure, you should be free to do so. Governmental policy should allow you to do so without restrictions. But no one will oblige you to do so. I mean, again, it's not a silver bullet. It's part of a bigger solution that has multiple different strategies. I'm not arguing that there must be an obligation on the individual to build its own network.
No, on the government.
Or no, on the government. Well, I will tell you an example again from Brazil is an incredible source of awful examples. So over the past 10 years, Universal Access Fund collected 20 billion reais. 20 billion reais. That with the current not very favorable change, exchange rate means roughly $5 billion, right? $5 billion. It's good money. There is an inquiry going on from the High Court of Auditors, because only 1% of that money from the Universal Access Fund has been used for connectivity, and 76% is unknown. It is not known. No one can tell you how it has been used. It's 76% of 5 billion. It's really a lot of money. And that money, I'm telling you, I mean, obviously, if the government were really interested and efficient in doing so, we were not speaking about this here. But if there are 3.6 billion people still unconnected, it means that the traditional solution we have been using, mainstream network, be them delivered by traditional operators or by the government, have not been effective.
And from what I've heard, it isn't just Brazil that have those percentages.
Exactly.
That's the general nature of those funds. Please.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing as in Africa. All that money is sort of not accounted for. I mean, mine is very similar in that I challenge the idea that we should be, so for rural people that are already experiencing a lot of inequality, that we should be putting onus on them to take care of this. And I understand that that's not the intention of getting network self-determination and legislation or other things, that it's really about making sure, and this also happens, making sure that community networks are not then targeted by corporations and sort of regulated out of the picture, which definitely happens in my context in the US. I'm from a rural place where community networks have struggled for legitimacy. But I do think that I think one of the issues is we put connectivity in its own context when governments are trying to incentivize building of connectivity infrastructure, and they're incentivizing companies to do it, and companies don't feel like there's profit to be made, so they don't even take the incentives that are offered to them sometimes. I think it's because we're not thinking about the underlying issue with that. Because if it's just connectivity equals Facebook, then I can really understand why people that have not already been connected maybe don't have an interest in connecting. That was something you said earlier on the slides, is like an interest to connect. But if they have to get their driver's license using the internet, or they have to seek medical care using the internet, then it's almost a critical service, in that if connectivity were provided maybe through the provision of those other critical services instead of a standalone, backbone of just telecommunications, then perhaps that could change. Because I think what we risk with not putting the onus on governments and companies is that, you're basically disenfranchising people twice, because one, they're not connected to the internet, but then two, they're also not able to get the services that they were previously able to get in an analog situation, because everything is moving online. So now they're doubly sort of stranded, right?
But
so that
again,
would be...
I just wanted to reiterate it. I mean, I'm not saying that the government should be disenfranchised to its obligations. I'm just saying that the government should not impede people from doing something that does no harm to anyone and only improves the standards of living of the local populations.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks,
Okay.
Luca.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you. And hopefully you'll join the list and we can continue the discussions there if you haven't joined already.
Sure. I've already joined.
Okay,
And
fantastic.
We could work on network self-determination as a new point of the...
A draft is always welcome.
Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, we'll go to the hackathon slides as soon as Niels gets them in.
Well, the cool thing is we had 3 relevant hackathon projects, which all will present. So I'll
Wanna
quickly...
use the microphone when you're talking. I know you're loud enough.
Where is
but-
the clicker?
Clicker. Do you still have it? Or there it is. Just
Take advantage of this to say that I have actually 5 copies of the book I was sharing with me. So if anyone wants them, they are for free. So just reach me there.
probably even sign them.
We had free cookies. We have free books. There we go. So 3 projects at the hackathon, one on WebRTC, HTTP status code 451, and we've been working on the qualitative analysis of IETF mailing list with Nick Doty and a couple of others. We've been collecting all the IETF mailing list archive. We've done some basic statistics, some word analysis, and some network analysis through the use of Jupyter notebooks and Python. We found a lot of issues, namely with a lot of encoding and the things that happen when people run their own mail servers. You can find the code on GitHub, so please contribute. We did it with a bunch of people, and we think it might be really interesting to analyze the participation in the IETF and see how that impacts the kind of decisions that are made and how it influences the process. So we've been looking at almost 2 million emails, from 190,000 email addresses from over 955 analyzed mailing lists, and of which one mail address sent over 80,000 of the messages. But most contributors send one or two messages, so that might be spam. If you look at the whole community, it is actually quite modular and integrated at the same time, which is integrated with only a few outliers. And some people might expect that early participants who've stayed a long time might dominate the discussions, and this is actually not the case we got from the statistics. And also, it's not just a few people that sent most messages. There's quite a long tail. Also, recent threats on IET, the longest threats on IETF at IETF.org are actually, long threads are actually quite recent and are also about issues that are relevant to discussions that we're having here in HRPC. So that's actually quite interesting, but it also shows that these topics are very alive within the community. The centrality shows you how many people are replying to who. The most central node, the redder the node, the more they reply to messages, and the whiter the node is, the less they reply to people. So if you're at a big node in the middle and you're white, that means that you're a rock star that never talks back to people that really likes you. We've been looking at word trends, and everyone can do the word trends for all the lists. So we've been looking, we just took 3 random concepts here where you see that there is an increase in discussion of security, a slow increase in the discussion on privacy. But actually, when you look at access, there was it was building up to a peak up to around 2007, but it's falling off right now. So if we want to understand more how these discussions are held in our community and also how they travel between mailing lists, have a look at the code and please contribute. Hiro, would you show the next?
Okay, thank you. My name is Hirotaka. I'm talking about HTTP status code 451, which is IRC 7725. So during the hack, no, no. Yeah. So during the hackathon, we improved the web crawler to collect which website actually returns HTTP status for 451, because we already have the RFC, but we don't see lots of the deployments on about the HTTP 451 status code 451. So from last IETF, no, that's okay. Yeah, we can take a look with this. Yeah, so from last couple IETF, we created the web crawler to crawl which website returns the 451, and this time we made the block collector, so which collects the statistical information that which website actually returns the 451 from the crawler, and also we have the web browser extension like Google Chrome extension, so which that we made during the hackathon. So this is the screenshot of the 451 reporter. So if the browser or if the crawler finds any 451 status code, that we can see which website returns the 451. Yep. So now we have the data collector, so we can. So if you're interested, then you can check. You can get the source code from the GitHub, and which actually right now that crawling the reddit.com, that which potentially returns 451 status code from the Germany. but unfortunately, I couldn't find any 451 status code. Actually, we finished crawling yesterday, and there's no 451 status code at this moment. But if you think there's any potential 451 status code, the website which returns 451 web status code, please use that data corrector and also a crawler and also collector. And so I think next step is we can use that data if we found some, so we can put some input to this working group, and also that improves the 451 status code draft. Thank you.
Just want to mention that all the slides are on the in the data tracker. So please go through them. I'll stop and take, if anybody would like to ask a question on any of, because this was the end of the hackathon. Oh, no, there's one more? Okay, please, sorry. And then after that, we can take questions on all of the hackathon before moving on.
Hey everyone. Yeah, so my name is Siobhan. So for the hackathon, Christine, Alp, and I, we worked on examining how different browsers implement WebRTC, or in particular, how they get the local IP address. So WebRTC is a technology which is basically used to do real-time communication in browsers, and especially peer-to-peer. And for this, they need the local IP address. But the thing is that we found that Firefox and Chrome, they don't ask the user for any kind of permission when they get the local IP address, but Safari does, and would not work if the user hasn't given like a camera permission or an audio permission. So in the hackathon, we made like a demo website just to showcase that.
We got our first demo. So exciting.
Sure, use this.
So this is the website. It's netblog.github.io/webrtcprivacy. And this is Safari. So if I don't allow, so then, we did not get user permission, WebRTC supported, and it doesn't reveal any local IP addresses. But if I do give it permission, then it does see all of my my IP address, my local IP address. But if I go to Firefox and I click don't allow, it doesn't care. Yeah. So that's it. So basically, like, the idea is to showcase how different browsers have like a different implementation of WebRTC. But so this is not ideal either, because like Safari, the permission it's asking is microphone, but so it's not clear that this is related to your, like, the fact that it's revealing your local IP address, but at least it's some kind of user consent. But so it's just, I think it's just a place where more research should be done and more work should be done. And yeah, that's it.
And how does this relate to the VPN issue?
So please use the microphone. You've got one there. You've got one here.
The VPN, like, we didn't really like look into that too much. Like, for the purposes of this hackathon, we were mainly focusing on, the case where you have like, a whistleblower in an organization who does not wish to be identified. So the local IP address is more important. But yeah, I mean, I think we didn't really try out, so can't really say too much. But I would imagine that it's the same issue with respect to that as well.
Thanks. And it would probably come into consent issues, because even on Safari, where you're giving consent to your microphone, you don't know that you're giving consent to your IP. So the fact that Safari asks for permission for your microphone really is not the same as asking for permission for your IP.
Exactly.
Okay, so go to questions now?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Hi. So I think that WebRTC stuff, I think it's a user agent issue. So I think it's good idea to talk to the WCC people in WCC.
Mhm.
They might have some privacy consideration on their standards. So probably it's the very good information to input them up to have a discussion about the privacy issue.
Yeah, I mean, so Mozilla and Google I think have been pretty clear that they don't want to do this, at least in the privacy discussions that have been happening up to this far. And, the WebRTC, like IETF working group doesn't exist anymore. But yeah, I think maybe we can talk to the W3C privacy group, like you said.
Thank you.
Thanks. So any questions on any of the hackathon discussions that went by before we move on? One's coming. Oh, yes.
Sure. Wendy Seltzer from W3C to say thank you for putting together this demo, and I very much hope that you'll share that with the WebRTC working group, because that kind of input is very helpful to us in making sure that we have the right privacy considerations, which is our aim in all the work that we do.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. That's great. Okay, thank you. So seeing no more questions, I guess we'll go on now to draft IETF HRPC guidelines. Is that you, Niels?
Yeah, so as Avri mentioned, there is RG adoption of the draft, so yay. There is one small change, and that is a change in relation mentioned by Mark Perkins in a reference. We refer to intellectual property, but intellectual property was not thus described in the Universal Declaration as we refer to it. So we changed it into the original text. After that, I got an email. I'm not sure if it was on the list or directly to me. Yeah, from Teresa, that it's a bit unhappy that there is only a masculine tense here. So we changed it between square blocks into we replaced he is to they are, and made it clear that did not come from the UDHR. That's it. I think we will work with this more, and we'll see more changes in relation to the review team, but we have that later on the agenda. So if there are no questions.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. So is the review team, or maybe you can cover this later, using this one, and is there sort of a feedback loop, or do we need to make sure that there's a feedback loop? I see a head nodding, so there will be a feedback loop on this. This is one of the things where I'm personally very concerned that we get a certain amount of rigor in these guidelines so that as time goes by, we'll have things that people can really count on. So go to the line. You're the first in the line.
Nick Doty, UC Berkeley. I'll certainly follow up on the list with some comments, but I thought one useful thing to discuss in person would be how we're coming up with the list. Like there's 19 things in the table of contents, and I'm curious how we're coming out with that list, because for example, there's a lot of things like confidentiality, integrity, authenticity, anonymity, pseudonymity that are also covered in the privacy and security considerations recommendations, and so I was just quite confused reading it, and I don't know how we're going to do reviews if we're hitting the same topics multiple times in different documents.
Yes. So the reason why they got there is that they are imported from RFC 8280, whereas also the methodology why they got there. So leaving them out would be problematic. But what we try to do is cross-reference as much as possible to RFC 6973 and 4949, or what is the security considerations one. So I think we could largely import the work that is being done or respect the work that's being done by the security and privacy work and work around that where, but it might be that when people are looking at it from a human rights angle at privacy issues, it might be slightly different. But I think that's also a question that hopefully will come up and we will work out when we're doing the actual reviews. Does that annoy you?
Leaves you skeptical, certainly.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's another way to put the question. Like, is this document for the reviewers, or is this like for, or is that for people who are reading 8280 and trying to understand human rights? Like,
I think this one was intended mostly for reviewers. And as the 8280 is there as the whole document, this one, and then everybody said, it's way too long. It's way too, it's got good stuff in it, but it's way too long to be useful. Therefore.
Right. So I guess maybe I'm just thinking, like, if we're going to say it's for reviewers, then we don't have to have every, like we can consolidate for the sake of the reviewer.
So perhaps something like, and pardon me, is just to add something that sort of says, if you're doing a privacy review and this is already covered there, then you could skip this one. But for the purpose of testing the guidelines, and as what we're looking at in the review team is for people to test the guidelines, they may not be doing the privacy review, or it may be done separately. So having them there may be useful, but making it conditional on if you're not doing a privacy review. Could also come out different. But you jumped up to say something in response, so I should give you a chance.
Yeah, it's not only for the reviewers, it's also before everything for the internet draft authors, so they can check their own protocol in the spirit of RFC 6973 on privacy, on the one on security consideration. I don't remember the number, but these two RFC are actually used by a lot of internet draft authors, because if they don't use them, they will be cut later on by the IESG. So the idea is in the future that maybe they will use these guidelines as well.
But since it's still just a research document, it can't make assumptions about how it's being used. Okay, any other questions? Thank you. But so maybe we can, though, just sort of add a line, if you're actually doing this for a review and doing a privacy review, cut and paste or ignore. Okay. So yeah, that one's you too, right? Oh no, that one's good. Thank you.
Always had, just never realized.
Okay. About the anonymity draft. So the draft is adopted, whatever it means, by the research group. So here is the name. Up to now, there have been very few reviews. Have we mentioned this at the beginning, that the work of a research group or a working group is to read draft, to review, to comment, because otherwise we don't know if it means that the draft is great and there is nothing to change, or if it means it's so broken that people cannot comment on it. So please read and review. And I also noticed that if you care about a document and want reviews, you have to do review for other documents. So I will. A few open questions that are in the draft. For instance, if you read it, you will see that there are several places where there is a to-do, TODO. It's things that should be improved, really should be improved. For instance, there are some examples of why it's good to have anonymity, but not a lot. Maybe it's not in this draft because there are a lot of documents, either from academics or for activists, about why anonymity is important. So maybe we should just reference them or include them. But anyway, we need something. There is also a section about why some people disagree with anonymity or say that anonymity must be limited. This section could also be improved with more examples on the whether it's a good idea or not, this sort of thing. For instance, on Monday, the IESG adopted the draft on the effects of pervasive encryption on operators, which explains that the operators, because of encryption, there is a lot of things that they cannot do anymore, such as modifying the HTTP request in transit to add personal information in it. Because of encryption, it's no longer possible. So the draft explains the point of view of the operator. This is a sort of thing that is that should be read in the context of the discussion on anonymity. So I think up to now that there have been little interest as seen is in reviews, in comments, in etc. So, in my opinion, if the draft for the draft to go somewhere, we need much more involvement from the research group. And so I just asked to read, to comment, to review, and it's maintained on GitHub, so you can also send pull requests. You're welcome.
Thanks. Avi Dorian, I wanted to ask a question. At first, I wanted to apologize. I read it and never got around to writing down the questions that I wanted to ask. But a couple of things that occurred to me while I was reading it is the anonymity and the right issue. And so, in other words, how is it a right? Describing its relationship to rights. Is it derivative in some sense? Is it an enabler of rights? So some discussion on that. And, anonymity seems a good thing, but that discussion doesn't seem highly developed. I was wondering whether there were levels of anonymity, and I was thinking about that, and I was looking at things like, one of the things that worries me most now is we're identifying ourselves. We're all going out. Actually, I don't, but we're all going down and identifying ourselves with our biometrics so that we can use our things easily. How does that relate to anonymity? Does that blow it out of the water completely? Or is there a warning to be put in there? So I'm wondering whether it's useful to have a discussion in there of biometrics in that. Yeah, I had some other small questions, but I'll ask those later. But those were really the ones that really had struck me while I was reading it.
For the first point about the relationship to human rights, I agree with you. That's something to be done.
Wendy Seltzer, thank you. I do think that this is an important area. And I will offer a review and some comments. One thought I had on sort of the framing is that anonymity is valuable sort of as a compositional issue, that you can build identity on top of protocols that start from anonymity. It's much more difficult to build anonymity on top of protocols that start with strong identity. So as long as we see some value in anonymity, and I think we do as connected to human rights and expression and association, then it's valuable to assure that we start from there in protocol design.
Yeah. And that's why it's a problem for the IETF. When we design protocols, we have to take care of this because, as you said, if the protocol itself reveals everything, it will be very difficult to delete it afterwards.
Hi, Brian Whitten. I wanted to echo the thanks for this important work on anonymity, defining the protocol considerations. One of the things that strikes me, though, is most of the places we go on the web, if we show up as completely anonymous, we stick out like a sore thumb. And that to be believably anonymous, we need some sort of a persona that might be crafted. It might not even be true. So a lot of people, when they're trying to be anonymous, they have a phone number for one persona, an email address for one persona, and then in their other personas, they have other phone numbers, other email addresses, and other characteristics. And they keep these identities separate. And it's just that aspect of anonymity or pseudonymity just didn't seem well developed in the draft. And I wanted to throw that up for discussion to see if there was sort of alignment in principle. And if so, I'm happy to help flesh out that text.
One of the reasons why it's not well developed is that the draft is mostly focused on infrastructure, the things that every user has to use. You are not forced to use Facebook or to buy on Amazon, but if you use the internet, you will reveal a lot of things. So it seems to me that there have been a lot of discussion outside of IETF about things like the rights of the user to some anonymity or pseudonymity when using services like Amazon, Facebook, etc. But little discussion about consequence for anonymity of the infrastructure of the internet, for instance, IP itself. And this is clearly something that could be done in the IETF or IRTF, while other issues such as anonymity in a database, for instance, we are not the best experts, and it's already handled by other people, I think.
So I would say, coming from the security group, there is a lot of work there in authentication of various kinds, PKI based as well as Kerberos based. So it's not just cookies and CSRF tokens, but these things all have relationships with each other, and then they get tied to IP addresses, and then they get used to link IP addresses together. So I would recommend that we broaden the scope a little bit in that regard.
Why not? But there is also a simple practical problem. As I said, we had very little activity on the draft. So I would suggest instead that maybe it's better to focus on a few things we really know about, because the entire issue of anonymity, identity, authentication is extremely wide. And we clearly have a limited workforce in the group.
To ask one quick clarifying questions then, if I bring expertise in those areas, would you want me to help flesh?
Especially if you bring text.
Okay, thank you. I will bring text. Thank you.
It's a research group doc now, so
Thank
you know you got something to say and it's not in there. Contribute text.
Wanted to make sure the text was welcome. It sounds
Yes,
like it is.
text
Thank you
is
so much.
welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, and I'll cut the line after where it is.
Well, Mallory Nodal. One idea is you have pseudonymity, which is quite good, but we could also talk about randomization. It's kind of related. Like sometimes if you don't pass certain values, you're not allowed to connect, or the protocol won't work, but you can randomize certain things. So there's some ideas there. And my second comment was about the section, I think that's new, about objections against anonymity. I would recommend just killing that section and using it to basically enhance your introduction or your arguments that you make further up in the document, rather than presenting the opposition. You just sort of, you know what the opposition is, and you write your introduction and your supporting arguments with those in mind. That's just a recommendation, though.
Were you at the plenary yesterday? Because I've been a discussion about this, about the draft on this draft, the one on effect on encryption, with the supporters of this draft said that we have to write down the reason people don't want or don't like encryption, so we can, once it's documented, we can do something about it. And other people like me said that, well, writing it in an RFC, in an official RFC, will probably have exactly the opposite effect, giving them some credence.
Yes.
So it's probably more or less the same problem here.
I agree.
Nick Doty, UC Berkeley. First of all, I'll commit to sending review comments. I hadn't gotten to that yet, and I have a lot of comments that can't work right now. So some of those will come in email. I was sort of a +1 on the idea about perhaps broadening this to pseudonymity, or I guess maybe more to the point, I think maybe we can't, I don't think we can do a very good job describing the protocol considerations if we're just talking about anonymity. That I think actually there's been a trend to not use the term anonymity because it is so misleading. The idea that you could be completely anonymous in a set as opposed to having some control over pseudonyms or their breadth. So that was my concern, and I'm curious about how we want to do it for this document. That if we're just talking about anonymity, which can have very specific or otherwise very misleading definitions, it might be more useful for us to look at the breadth of pseudonyms or identities more generally.
The draft has definition for anonymity and pseudonymity, because one of the problems is outside of the IETF, people use anonymity for everything. Even inside the IETF, Absolutely. I'm not sure that all IETF participants are very clear about that, but the draft has definition relying on previous RFC. If these definitions are incorrect, or if the draft afterwards use them wrongly, please comment, scream, do something, because indeed one of the points of the draft is to be very clear about what it is to be anonymous, to be pseudonymous, or this sort of thing. So if it's not clear, then the draft is useless. So please, if there is a specific problem with this, speak up.
Okay, follow up. Thanks.
Okay. Oops, that was wrong. Volker Burg from PEP.
It's a feature.
Yes, it's
Yeah,
a feature.
now you can hold it comfortably.
Okay. I try not to destroy it. First, I like the draft, and I really like the definitions, and I want to add something. We are actually implementing anonymity features in our apps, and we have another thing which I'm a little missing. I can combine it out of the other definitions, I think, but like using them like a toolbox, which is what definitions are for. We are differing between a person talking to another person, and no attacker can even know who is talking to whom, even not know that people are actually talking. That is, I think, coming close to what you call anonymity. But actually, there's another thing, which is two people are talking to each other and they even don't know who the other person is. And that's two very different things to implement. I can name the applications. The applications for the second one is obviously, for example, for leaking things. We call it internally the WikiLeaks feature, if you want to. And I think because that's very different from implementing, and a IETF draft has usually the intention to help implementers getting things done. I think that could be something you could add. Unfortunately, I don't have a good name for it. So beside WikiLeaks feature, we call it full anonymity against anonymity, but perhaps you have a better name.
Thanks. And can you give your name and where the We Are Working is?
Yes, I'm Volker Birk from Pretty Easy Privacy.
Thanks. Any comment? No. And again, the offer of text where something to be explained isn't in there yet is a wonderful thing.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone else? Final word? Okay, then we'll move on to the next one. Thank you. Okay. And the next one is association. Is that you? No. Oh,
I think it's Gisela.
Is she online?
Gisela, can you...
Oh, yeah, we got the big
one. There you go.
Hi, everyone. How's it going?
Hi.
Hi.
It's yours.
So will you start? Will you take it away?
Yeah. Okay, so we are making a lot of progress and taking a lot taking into consideration a lot of the wonderful comments and very rich discussion that has been going on at the HRPC mailing list. Niels loves this quote, and I am starting to love it as well. We changed a little bit the arrangement of everything and just trying to think how the architecture itself impacts and enables or inhibits the right to association, but also vice versa. If we could apply the right to association legal standards to the internet itself as an infrastructure, and what would it mean? So a quick overview of the changes. We ditched the right to protest as an angle of analysis because that's where the original idea came from. But we later realized that just association and assembly by itself were way more interesting, and protest was just making a lot of noise, so we ditched that. We removed the filter bubble section in the literature review because there was the opposite of consensus on that. We were discussing a lot about the approach towards that, so we just removed it as well so we can advance on building this consensus. We have new vocabulary. We were taking vocabulary from the past RFC that I don't know the RFC numbers by heart, but maybe Niels and all the rest of you do. We have different research questions as well that I'll show in a second. Changes the structure, and we added two discussions in the end: protocols versus platforms and the internet as an association. So the first research question, you'll see it's pretty much the same. It's basically what the guidelines have been building upon. And the second one, we changed it just like this. If the internet is indeed used to exercise freedom of assembly and association, what are the legal and technical implications of this at the infrastructure level? So that's the new vocabulary. I don't think it makes sense to go through all of it, so I'll just throw it back to Neil so he can talk about the discussion we had around defining internet.
Yeah. So what happened in several of these discussions, as happened during RFC 8280, so it's starting to become a familiar thing, that we need to have technical, legal, and somewhat sociologist explanations for, or concepts from science and technology studies to come to the same thing. So an example here is where we look at internet. So there we have the standard technical one, the network that consists of ASs that are connected through IP. But then we also have other beautiful ones with it, that it's a persistent socio-technical system over which services are delivered, but also a techno-social assemblage of devices, users, sensors, networks, routers, governance, administrators, operators, and protocols. And then as last, because Andrew loved the emergent process so much, we have an emergence process-driven thing that is born from the collection of the ASs that happen to be together at a given time. The fact that they tend to interact at any given time means it's an emergent property that happens because they use the protocols defined at the IETF. So I think this definition is somehow a bit it's a bit what we do here. So I really like the beauty. We've added the new structure. So we added a part on IRC, which we did not have. Giselle and I first talked about XMPP, but XMPP was already extensively discussed in RFC 8280. So we looked at IRC, found some interesting things in the grouping together. We ditched the process, but looked a bit better at ASs and had a lot of discussion about that. And on suggestion of Stephen Farrell, he said we had after a thorough review, we initially said we do not look what happens on top of the network, but we do. But now we added something on protocols versus platforms, and we had a discussion of the internet itself as an association, as assembly. We'll get to get on that. Gisela, are you taking over, or am I continuing? Maybe
I can take over just to explain the difference between this, and then it'd be great if you could continue. So in the beginning, we said that the internet constituted an assembly, but Sandra Brannan gave us great comments at last IETF session regarding the lack of accuracy in our definitions. But because assemblies are temporary in nature, we changed to the internet as an association. And we argue that that is exactly the point. So, yeah, you take over, Niels.
So then we come to the conclusion that the internet is made up of interconnected ASs, which jointly form an association, and that association should be protected. But what does that mean? Because it might not be the only association. Because if every network is an association, within the association that the internet is, does the AS have an absolute freedom to implement its own rules, or should it rather have commitment to the larger association? So does the importance of a functioning larger association, the internet, prevail over the preference of a smaller association? And how does it then, what does then happen if there is an assembly of two people that associate over two ASs that's then over the one association that's the internet? So what is the relation between these assemblies and associations, and how is that prioritized, and what does that actually mean? So one could arguably say that the largest association enables the most assemblies, so that one should be most protected. But in the human rights practice, one normally argues from starting from the end user, from the rights holder, which in this case would be the end users that are assembling. So that would mean it's from the other way around. So that is something that we would really like to discuss with you, because that really changes the conclusions. And then also there was a thing that we asked ourselves, like, when does an AS become part of the association of the internet? Is it when it receives an autonomous system number? Is it when it announces it routes, or when it starts shipping packets? And if it only routes with another AS over the internet, is it still part of that association? And what are the implications of stating that the internet should be protected as association?
So just one quick comment. Since the beginning, we started discussing about like private networks having a public impact, therefore aligning towards the larger public ensemble. And we kind of left it over in the middle of very many other super interesting discussions. And recently in the mailing list, we went back to it, and it is also reflected on the draft itself. So I would also, echoing on what Niels is saying, would love to comment forward more on that. And what we have discussed lately is where to go, how to conclude this, how to start closing up all the discussion and ideas that have been lying around. So in terms of the legal, I'm going to start with the legal. I'm trying to take all of the consequences of the right to association and apply them to the internet as an association, because that is our thesis. And in terms of technicalities, could it be that the technical consequence of this is the obligation to pass some packets? So that's more or less where we are right now. And if you want to add anything, Niels?
No, I'm very curious actually what people might say and think on where we should take this, and whether this way forward sounds reasonable, and whether there are major critiques or disagreements.
First, I'd like to ask, how many people have actually read the reworked version? That's a good number. That's good. So we don't have anybody at the line yet. Is that just because there's no comments? Okay. At the end of this, I'm also going to ask, after we've gotten the line, whether this has progressed and changed enough, since I assume you still want this to become a research group document. So at the end of the discussion, I'll ask if we're there yet, and then go on from there, but please.
Hi, this is Corinne. Hey, Gisela. Feature not bug. So I had a question in terms of where you want this to go, in a sense that I think the discussion has been really interesting on the list, but especially for people who aren't very well versed in like the kind of stuff that HRPC does, it might be a little hard to understand why we're having this conversation and like what the problem is it is trying to solve by trying to figure out whether this is an association or an assembly.
You want to take that, Gisela, or shall I?
I can take the association and assembly part. Legally, they have different implications because one has a more formal and established nature, and the other one is rather temporary. The assembly is temporary, and the association is formal. Thanks for the question, Corinne, by the way. So it has different legal implications that could repercute as well in the technical and infrastructure level. And regarding the research group, the HRPC bigger perspective, I think Niels can be better suited to answer that.
Yeah, so I think your question is a bit, why are you spamming my mailbox with this theoretical discussion and relevance, etc.? Well, I think the answer can be found in the charter, is that we're trying to understand the impact of rights on protocols and protocols on rights, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. So even though that sometimes needs a significant layer of abstraction, but if we have discussed the freedom of association and assembly, I would really like to have the feeling that we discussed it from the rights to the tech part and back again. And perhaps that's sometimes ad nauseum, but that's what research is.
Mallory Nodal, just a suggestion on how you tackle some of these questions, like around when does an AS become associated, rather than maybe asking the determination, like that question up front, just exploring the nature of that activity. Is that association? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, so instead of asking, does this make ASs an assembly, but just talking about the things that ASs do within the context of how that maybe shakes out as an assembly or an association, if that makes sense. And then that takes the pressure off of you having to determine up front what you want to say.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Andrew Sullivan. I've got to admit that I continue to struggle with this draft, and I just, I sent some things to the list already, but I think there's a deep confusion in this, because I think you're not distinguishing between ASs just being a tool of individuals all the time versus the individuals themselves. And it seems to me that the individuals have rights, but I don't really see how you get from those individuals to the ASs or the internet or any of these underlying things being an association or an assembly or any of that stuff. It's just, it might be a forum for this thing, although I feel uncomfortable with that because it's not really a space. So there's a whole, really, I think what's happening is you're working very hard with a bunch of concepts that work well for meat people walking around in the world, and you're trying to pull that in and overworking the metaphor of cyberspace, and that is causing that's causing, for me anyway, the difficulty that I'm having with the terms here, and so I'm just afraid that there isn't a way to make this work because the concepts don't really fit the underlying mechanism. It's like, sometimes when I'm reading this, I feel like you're saying, well, if I put a whole bunch of cars together, is it an assembly or an association? Well, neither. It's just a pile of cars. It's traffic, or it's a parking lot, or something like that. And I this is a similar sort of, it's just a technology, and it's the humans that you're trying to talk about. So I don't know if that's very helpful, but I still don't think this is ready to adopt.
And I think I'm trying to think of it. Maybe you're right, but I haven't come to the same conclusion as you yet. And I think a newspaper or a media house or a radio station is itself also a technology that's enabling freedom of expression, and it's actually the people that are doing it. But still, the whole licensing scheme and the way people work and the labor laws and etc. They are a specific ordering that enable or disable a kind of enabling of rights. So the same is true for the internet infrastructure, and people do associate over the internet. So I think it's important that we try to understand what the structure and potential consequences are of that, and the reason for doing that and to go through it ad nauseum is because else someone else might do it for us. So I'd rather have this maybe sometimes confusing or irritating discussion here than that someone comes up with it elsewhere, because we keep on saying that if non-technical people make decisions about this, then it's shitty. So that's why I'd rather have this discussion with the people.
Well, I can buy that, but I mean, you've just actually walked right across the distinction that is the point I was trying to make. So a radio station, for instance, is a corporation. It's got a radio station is always, or not always, but mostly controlled by somebody, some collection of people. I can identify who those are. The point of the bit that you quoted from an email that ended up in the document is precisely that it's fuzzy at the edges. There's no boundary. I can't say what the internet is today, because at any given moment it's this sort of fuzzy collection, and it fades out at the edges. Is a node on the quote on the internet behind the great firewall? Is it on the internet or not? Well, kind of yeah, kind of no. And that's not a thing you can say about, like, is this an employee of the radio station? Yes or no? Well, you've got an answer to that. It's a legal answer. And I think that I believe that fuzziness in the one case and the non-fuzziness in the other case is part of the problem here. Now, I agree with you that maybe the answer here is, well, it's neither an association nor an assembly. It's a different kind of thing. And if you try to use this other kind of framework and beat the internet with it, you're going to have an unsatisfactory conclusion because it's the wrong tool. Anyway, I don't want to take up all the time. So thanks.
Yeah. Okay, you're getting up, so you'll be the end of the line because, and yeah, please.
Brian Witten again. So I would agree that the document is not yet ready for adoption. I would also echo the importance of the area. For instance, when I think of the social credit system that's emerging in China, and I think of the potential for that system to actually hurt people just based on who they associate with, having a lower social credit score than them, and the many different ways that can hurt them. I think work like this is very important. At the same time, in my mind, I struggle to separate association from anonymity, because one aspect of our identity and one aspect of our anonymity is, with whom and with what metadata we're associated. And so those friendships, those relationships are part of our identity. It's part of our anonymity. And so I'm wondering if this work could be folded in with the anonymity draft as that takes more maturity. But again, echo the importance of the area and +1 on the not yet ready for adoption, although I applaud the work.
Thank you.
I would not want to lug our piece of problem onto the anonymity draft, because the anonymity might even get more problems by importing this thing.
Sometimes when problems are interrelated, you can only solve them together.
Good point.
Good point. Good point. Fair.
Peter Gordienik, I just wanted to join the confused individuals that voiced their confusion before me, especially in those situations where I don't know why you try to go into much detail when you describe technology or technical terms like the DNS and the autonomous systems. There's almost an obsession to get some connotation attached to the AS, which doesn't really match the technical terms. And by shifting this from one sphere, like the technical sphere, into the sociology or social sciences sphere, the connotation breaks, and then of course the analogy breaks. So to that extent, maybe less would be more, as in not trying to do this right now and do it afterwards. So we get a bit easier to the core of the message, because
so would people feel happier if the last, because actually, so the part people are hating is the last part, I guess, right? The discussion on the internet as an association.
Well, I'm not commenting on hate.
I didn't hear hatred. I heard a little bit of discomfort and confusion.
Because we could consider cutting that. I would like to understand if people are, if that's the source of confusion and problems, then perhaps we should consider that and try to move the rest of the draft along and keep that for a research part for another bit. Maybe if we look at BGP or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, probably. So I was especially confused by section 6.3 and
okay. So I'm curious, Andrew, if we cut 6.3, would that take away significant parts of your confusion as well?
Probably. I read it pretty quickly. I mean, it just came out. So I think probably the bits that talk about, what the internet is in this are the ones that are most problematic for me. I think that's probably fair.
Okay, then maybe we have a way forward and a clear way. Right. Does that you agree, Gisela?
Yeah, and also, like, on a really quick note, I think the effort here is also trying to stop separating the technical from the social and the political, because more and more they come intertwined. So, I mean, we could argue towards there, but yeah, maybe we can, from this, we can take a way forward. I'd be happy with that.
Are you okay with me to wait about asking again? Okay, thank you. So I got a head nod. That doesn't translate too well on.
Yes.
Right, but thank you. Okay, then we should move on to the next ones, or did you want to say? And you're all ready to move on. Are you political?
Let's see how political this gets. So the HRPC political, we're doing this work because in RFC 8280, we've been trying to research the protocol impacts on human rights. And with this draft, we're also understanding the dynamics impacting protocols and architecture development. So we're trying to describe the political aspects of protocols, also because these came up time and again as discussion in this research group. And it is because the internet is a part of the basic infrastructure of information societies, and protocols that are being developed here in the IETF influence these. And a part of this process is political, and political here includes economics, but this is not described in RFCs. So we need to take this into account if we want to understand our own decision-making process, and making this explicit helps us to understand and take it into account. Also, if it sometimes makes us uncomfortable. And I was very happy to see that we were not the only ones struggling with this, because a part of this was also discussed by the Internet Architecture Board in their blog post on consolidation. And there was also an interesting discussion on the IETF at IETF lists about this, as well as Architecture Discuss. So the latest changes, a lot of typos. Thank to Mark Perkins for going so thoroughly through 3 drafts. That was really appreciated. Lots of work. A lot of people, several people contacted me about this off list, and this resulted actually a really good discussion. Added a position that all protocols are political sometimes, and is largely based on the law of unintended consequences. Improved examples in the field of competition, also by separating standards general and IETF specific parts. Added more dynamics about standard development general and IETF in specific. So where do we go with this? Is there anything missing? And are we also causing a ridiculous amount of confusion with this draft, or do we feel like, well, this is about it?
Any comments? Nobody at the line? Nothing's missing? Somebody's coming to the line.
So for Brian Whitten again. So for political, I thought one seminal work that could add value, if just mentioned, cited, and maybe even pull a little bit from, is a seminal paper by Aragaway on the moral character of cryptographic work, because it really speaks to the heart of how what we do with protocols really matters, ethically, morally, politically, in people's lives, etc.
Could you share that one on the list? Then I'll make sure that
I sure will, as soon as I get permission to post to the list.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. So, any other? Yeah. This is an awkward room to maneuver. So someone is coming to the line. Oh, now please come to the microphone and introduce yourself and do that.
Harry Halpin, INRIA. So I think this is a very important topic. And I think that the question which I have to, I guess, the chairs and stuff is, what is the criteria for RG adoption? So obviously we need to understand the politics of standards. We're operating in a standards body. There will be political ramifications of the standards we create. Having a document which explains this background very well is very useful. Do we imagine this being operationalized somehow in a future process?
Not necessarily. I mean, this is a research group. So I think, the criteria has been that there's a consensus in the group that, yes, we want this to be our document as opposed to just his, that they are ready to give up their control of it and make it our document. But operational, not necessarily. I mean, some of the things with considerations in them, like 8280, yes, that was meant to be operationalized once it's verified, etc. This, not necessarily. It doesn't need that. It just needs the group to be comfortable. Yes, please. The other chair.
As author, I think I really want to understand, to map the problem space before, and then maybe consequences of that or specific problems arising from that might come into a new draft. But I think if we first have this, if we first can agree on this, I'm already really happy with having that in a document, actually.
Yeah, in which case I would strongly support RG adoption.
Okay, thanks. And I just want to take this moment to salute the little bit of business when you touched your hat to say as author. I thought that was good.
Theresa Enghardt, I read the draft, and to be honest, I was a little confused by everything by the structure from section 4 onwards. Like section 3, I can understand it's different positions that some people have. And then 4 until the end, I'm like, what are these headings? What are these sections supposed to tell me? I just went back to the abstract and it says here we are mapping different positions. And I'm like, okay, that's section 3, but the rest, like, what is the focus? But I've only read it once and then got really confused.
Yeah. Yeah. So section 3 was different positions that people had, and section 4 is different ways in which it plays out. But I agree we should we should clean that up and make that more structured. Yeah, we could work on that. Thanks for that suggestion.
Nick Doty, I think I had similar confusion. And in particular, I think if we want to have more reviews or possibly go for the research group, I think the abstract and introduction need to match the rest of the document or our common understanding, because I struggled to read the document and understand what was going on, and I think in particular it's not clear to me from reading the document or from this discussion whether the purpose is to map different views of politics on standards or to make a proactive argument that we need to change IETF process or we need to consider politics in a certain way. And I think if we don't have that clarified, like I don't even know how to send comments on the list until we have some context on that.
Okay, so I think I've gotten clue without asking a general question that it's not quite ready, and I'm getting a head nod. Okay, great. Thank you. And so you'll keep working on it, and we'll keep coming on. Okay, so we're now up to update on implementation of 451. Or did we already do that? No, we did part of it, right? Right. Oh, that's where you had stuck that one. I see.
Yeah. So for the draft new protocol elements, basically what I'm trying to do is propose new protocol elements to HTTP 451 to make it more useful and to reflect how it's actually being used. So yeah, it is an individual draft, and the recommendations I was making were based on feedback, and the research done was that we should have a geographical scope to the response that we get, so that because blocks are often nationally scoped, so if you are getting an HTTP 451 response, then you probably want to know where it was blocked. So that's one. So the other thing was to disambiguate, so make a difference between like blocking authority and the implementer of the block. So for example, like the entity mandating the block would be a court or a government, and the actual implementer of the block would be an ISP, and it's important to distinguish between these two things. So the work done was to combine this draft with the draft many folks HRC RFC 7725. So basically what this draft now also has is the guidelines from RFC 8280 as applied to 451. And yeah, so I guess the next steps would be, I've spoken to Mark Nottingham if there's interest in the HTTP working group to adopt it. So not sure entirely right now. But yeah, so I guess I'll be working with him or them to figure what the next step should be.
Thank you. How many people have read this one? Okay, a much smaller number. Okay, anybody wish to comment?
Hey, thanks. This is Corinne. I just wanted to say I think this is really useful. I think it does a lot of the stuff that we've been aiming to do, which is like take the discussion that we have here and bring it to other working groups that are actually in the IETF. So I just hope we can continue doing this.
Okay. Yeah. In some ways, it's almost serving as a first template on a way to work with something. So
great.
I think it's really great. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Then the next thing, you want to go back. I think the next thing is discussion on the Human Rights Review Team, which I really want to hear about. Yes, there it is.
Hello, me again. So we now have a Human Rights Review Team. What does it mean? A review team is a team that reviews. Basically, that reviews internet drafts, which means reading them, understanding them, and then making comments, remarks, etc. A lot of people, especially when they are new to the IETF, believe that a review team is something very organized, very formal, requiring approbation by the IAB, IESG, etc. But in reality, most of the review teams that you can see during discussion in the IETF are quite informal, even sometimes unofficial. I mean, two people can gather together and declare we are a review team. It's a freedom of association. It's good. Of course, their comments won't have any specific weight unless they are good. The point is that review team are typically not official part of the process. I mean, they comment. If the comments are good, they can be taken into account. Otherwise, no. So a review team has to prove that its comments are worth it, and it has to establish a reputation. All the review teams that we know today, like Gen Art, for instance, started as a small group of very informal people and then build a reputation. So the human, it does not have to be sanctioned by a higher authority because it does not have any specific power. So current state, the review team exists, which means that we have a mailing list. At this time, it's all. Some review team have more formal groupware software to work together, issue trackers, things like that. We don't. At this time, it's just a mailing list, HRRT. It's public because, well, like everything, I mean, there is no formal membership of the review team. Anyone can join the list, but it's not supposed to be a general discussion list. We already have one for this. It's supposed to be a list focused on reviews. So publishing reviews, discussing meta discussion about the reviews, things like that. It's very recent and no review was done yet. So at this time, it's only vaporware, but we will try to turn it into something more concrete. So the reviews will be based on what? The idea is to focus on drafts which are in IETF-wide last call. I sent some examples to the mailing list because there are the drafts where IESG is asking for comment from anyone at the IETF. But of course, as I said, the review team is quite informal. So if people want to do reviews on other drafts, they can. On the method, the idea is to use the framework of draft guidelines, which is now draft IETF HRPC guidelines. It was just published this morning. Yeah. Which is itself a derivation of RFC 8280 section 6. Section 6 of the RFC 8280 is supposed to be the list of things that the RFC authors should check to be sure that their draft, their protocols, don't have unintended and bad human rights consequence. Because RFC 8280 is big, the idea was to move this part, the concrete part, to a separate draft, and the review team will both use the draft and guidelines to guide its work, and also will produce input about this draft. Does it work? Is it realistic? Is it a good thing or not? Maybe we should change the draft on guidelines, etc. So volunteers are welcome, but not too many. I mean, the review team is supposed to do reviews. So we don't really need people who just come here for sending one question. Then that's all. We mostly need people who will commit to do reviews and to discuss reviews with other people and with the IETF. Okay. Comments, remarks?
I've got one, and then hopefully people will come to the line. Okay, so when I was looking at it, I was sort of saying, okay, it's an independent activity that's kind of hanging out in the HRPC, but because of that it would be following the guidelines, and we spoke before about not only following the guidelines, but giving feedback as part of that it's also kind of an activity of the HRPC. So is it okay with you kind of, and with you kind of, to look at it in that sort of dual way? It's sort of independent, it's sort of hanging out here, but it's also an activity because it will feed back to the group.
In my view, yes, it's an activity of the HRPC research group. It has a separate mailing list because it seemed a good idea to focus on the actual work, concrete work on the review team, but it could have been also done on the HRPC mailing list. It's not a matter of principle, just of efficiency.
I just wanted to understand that because we hadn't talked a priori. Of course, So please, when you're talking, if that's not okay with you, say something, please.
Mallory Nodal, it's okay with me. I think that's a good idea. My comment was about what I think we could work on. So I'm already on the review team. We haven't really started yet, but besides doing last call drafts, I think it would actually be useful to go back and look at RFCs that are already out, even far long ago. And I'd like to volunteer to do a sort of simple mapping or even just creation of a matrix in which we can evaluate whether or not a draft is worth assessing. Because I think there's just so much that we probably risk being flooded. And if we had a quick way of determining whether or not either past, present, or future, in the case of IDs, are worth looking at. Maybe they're the right size, maybe they cover the right topic, maybe they're related to the work, we've referenced them in our other drafts. That hopefully would be useful as a starting point for some people to know where they want to dig in.
I already went through all the draft in IETF-wide last call to get an idea of how many were relevant for the review team.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them are on very specific and very detailed technical topics that I understand nothing about. So it's very difficult to find the human rights issues in it. Maybe there are, but
Exactly.
It's very difficult to dig them out. So that could be a first criterion.
Mm-hmm.
And then for your ID, why not? But the review team is made of volunteers. There is no hierarchy. So if people want to do a review of this draft, even if it does not fit the meta guidelines, there is nothing to prevent them. So it could be a good idea to have this sort of rules to filter the draft, but people won't be forced to follow them.
Of course.
Peter Koch-Dienig. More review is always good. To that extent, any initiative that organizes this can only improve the documents, and that's a good thing. What I missed a bit on your slides is, what are you trying to achieve? Usually the review teams are in support of one or more ADs. So what you might want to have is the ear of an AD to channel findings through. You can always post them to the IETF list, of course, but many of the other review teams again serve a particular AD. But you didn't say what the outcome should be. I hear we could go back to older RFCs to generate maybe more work for the research group, or is it to flag issues in proposed protocols or in protocols in last call?
My idea was more the flagging of future RFC. I mean, doing this analysis for existing RFC could be interesting to inform the discussion on the guidelines draft. And it could be interesting also if some people want to develop a BIS version of the RFC addressing the problems that we found. But at this time, and remember that we did nothing yet. It just took its shape. At this time, the idea is more to focus on a last call draft because we could flag problem related to human rights. And I don't agree with you. There are many review teams, not all of them related to an AD. Some are related to a specific technique. For instance, young people read all the drafts where there is a young module.
I wish young people would read all the drafts. Yeah.
This sort of thing. Yeah. So the idea is to focus, of course, on human rights. So to distill human rights issues in the draft and to mention that there is potentially a problem or things that could be improved or at least documented.
Excuse me for interrupting. We have only 3 minutes left. I want to be very careful. We're a research group. So it's fine for us to do this, and it's fine for us to scream in the wilderness that, hey, we found human rights stuff in this review, but I don't think we can operationalize it in such as attaching it to anything IETF-ish. I think we have to be very careful in that boundary. We're a research group, so we can shout, hey, we found human rights stuff in this last call document, and they can send it in as a last call document, as a last call comment, but we cannot cross that border.
I was trying to manage I was trying to manage the disappointment here. Like naturally, by addressing last calls, you're be the last minute obstacle, and assuming that human rights issues might not necessarily be in the detail and at the core of a protocol,
they might not care.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It would be another comment sent in on a last call that somebody didn't care about. Oh, well.
It's like hate HRPC, confused and disappointed.
Okay, but just a quick non-binding suggestion. Reviewing last calls is great. Everyone, I support more review. The message layer security group just had their charter vote. Google, WhatsApp, everyone's going to seem to go forward. Lots of obvious human rights connections to end-to-end encryption and group messaging, and they're basically making a charter with security properties and privacy properties. So another model or something which you could do in addition, if people have lots of time, would be to liaison with working groups which are in charter stage and talk to them about their threat models and their charter. And that could be informal or could be done over their mailing list. But I think that could be a way to influence new high profile work that hasn't quite got to the last call stage yet.
Yeah, as long as we carefully stay on our side of the border in that one too. And I think what we're doing is important in this group in the long run, but I want to be really careful not to transgress that IETF, IRTF difference.
I would say it differently. We have to be modest. We did nothing yet. So we should start slowly and build a reputation at a time. Corinne?
Hi, Corinne. I was wondering if I could provide a little bit of pushback to what you said, Avi, because I understand that you want everybody to stay in their lane for this work to be effective. But at the same time, you see people who are in this group going to IETF working groups, being there, standing there saying, listen, I work for the ACLU, the CDT, the Article 19, coming with a very specific perspective. And that isn't frowned upon as such. I also think we need to be bold to bring what we do here to other places.
Bold but careful.
Also, a very short suggestion how this review team could be useful for other groups. And I think especially advertising it as a service and saying, oh, if you're designing something, if you have something you're not sure about or you think that might have human rights considerations, come to us, we'll review it, and we look at that. And either we make you feel comfortable that you did the job right, or we point out things where it might be problematic. I think framing it this way would disappoint nobody and help to getting this stuff forward.
Okay, thank you.
Again,
we're at 1 minute over now.
Yeah, let's be careful because we cannot yet pose as the human rights review experts because we didn't do anything at this time, or not really. So better to start to build things, to send reviews, and then we will be able to outreach to the rest of the IETF and to tell them, hey, we provide a great service, but it's too early.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great idea. Thank you for the discussion. We got through all the agenda items except for open discussion and any other business, but we can have lots of open discussion on the list, and I really appreciate the amount of good discussion we had in the meeting. See you on the list. Thank you. And anybody that didn't do the blue signing thing, please come up and do the blue signing thing. No. So what? We done?
Done.
Done. Thank you.
You need to be early in the process.